The sky above Sentinel Ridge burned orange and red as another Coalition warship fell from orbit, its hull torn apart by Vexery weapons. That no shield could stop Admiral Kethvorin of the Silithian fleet stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched everything he had built crumble into fire. And ash for 3 months, his forces had held this world against the Dominion. And for 3 months, he had believed that victory was possible. He had been wrong. The Vexery had brought their Worldbreaker, a weapon so massive that it blocked out the stars when it moved into firing position, and when it fired, the beam cut through the Coalition fleet like a blade through waterships that had taken years to build vanished in seconds. Their crews never even knowing they were about to die. Admiral, his communications officer, called out, his voice shaking with fear he could not hide. "We have lost contact with the orbital defense platforms." "All of them?" Kethvorin asked, though he already knew the answer. "All of them, sir." The Admiral closed his 4 eyes and let the weight of failure settle onto his shoulders. Like a physical thing, 12 species had come together to defend this world. And 12 species would die here unless he did. Something. He opened his eyes and spoke the words. That tasted like poison on his tongue. "Signal all surviving vessels and ground forces to begin emergency evacuation through Corridor 7. And tell them to move fast, because we will not get a second chance." The order went out across every frequency, reaching the scattered remnants of what had once been the greatest military alliance in galactic history. But even as the survivors began to run, the Vexery were already moving to cut them off across the planet. Interdiction fields snapped into place like invisible walls, trapping everyone inside a cage of energy that no ship could pass through. Admiral Kethvorin watched his tactical display turn red in sector after sector, and he understood that his evacuation order had come too late. There would be no escape. There would be no rescue there. Would only be death or surrender. And the Vexery did not accept surrender in any way that mattered. His flagship shuddered as enemy weapons found it. And Kethvorin had just enough time to transmit one final message before the bridge exploded around him. "To all Coalition forces," he said, his voice calm despite everything. "It has been an honor to serve with you." Then there was only Fire General Lexala of the Morvani Collective stood in the command center of the last functioning Coalition cruiser and tried to find hope in the data streaming across her screens. She found none. Her species had evolved on a world filled with predators, creatures that hunted the Morvani through jungles of razor-sharp plants and across plains, where death waited in every shadow to survive. The Morvani had developed the ability to suppress their fear, to think clearly even when everything around them was falling apart. That ability had served Dexala well in her military career. But now she felt something she had not felt since childhood. She felt afraid. "General," Commander Yevshar said from beside her, his voice barely above a whisper, "we should consider negotiating with the Vexery, because some of our people might survive if we surrender now." Dexala turned to look at her second in command. Seeing the desperation in his eyes, "The Vexery do not take prisoners," she said. "They take slaves. And their labor camps are worse than any death we might face here." "But surely, there is no surely," Dexala interrupted. "There is only the truth. And the truth is that we are trapped here with no way out and no hope of rescue." The bridge fell silent as every officer present absorbed those words. They had all known it was bad, but hearing their commander say it out loud made it real in a way that numbers on a screen never could. Then the communications officer spoke up, her voice strange and confused. "General, I am receiving a transmission from inside the Vexery encirclement." "That is impossible," Yevshar said. "All our forces in that zone were destroyed hours ago." "It is not a Coalition signal, sir," the officer replied. "The identifier says it is coming from a Terran source." The word hung in the air like a question nobody knew how to answer. The Humans had joined the coalition only 4 cycles ago, barely long enough to learn how the alliance worked. And they had sent a token force to Sentinel Ridge as a gesture of support. 2,000 soldiers. Nothing more. Nobody had expected them to make a difference. Nobody had expected them to survive. Open the channel. The XLS ordered. The speakers crackled with static for a moment. And then a human voice filled the bridge. Calm and steady, despite the sounds of weapons fire behind it. Coalition Command. This is Colonel Marcus Webb of the Terran Expeditionary Force. And I have to say that it looks like you folks are having a really bad day up there. The XL exchanged a glance with Yevshar. Neither of them sure what to make of the casual tone in the human's voice. Colonel Webb, the XL replied, "How are you still alive?" "Well, General, that is a funny story. But I do not have time to tell it right now because my people and I are a little busy at the moment." More weapons fire came through the speakers, followed by shouting in the human language, and then silence for a few seconds. "Sorry about that," Webb continued. "One of those Victory Patrol units found us, and we had to deal with them. But anyway, I am calling because we have some information you might find interesting." "What information?" "The interdiction fields that are keeping your ships trapped are not coming from orbit. General, they are coming from 3 ground-based generators spread across the northern continent. And my people have located all 3 of them." The Exala felt her secondary heart begin to beat faster. "Are you saying you can disable them?" "I am saying we are going to try," Webb replied. "And I am asking permission to make the attempt because technically you are still in command of this mess and I like to follow proper procedure when I can. Colonel, you have 2,000 soldiers at most, and those generators will be heavily defended." "Yes, they will. You cannot possibly succeed." The human was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its casual tone and become something harder and colder. "General, let me tell you something about my people, because I think there has been a misunderstanding about what we are." "Go ahead. We are not diplomats who happen to pick up weapons. And we are not scientists playing at being soldiers. Because my species has been fighting wars since before we could write our own names." He paused, and Exala could hear him reloading his weapon. "We call ourselves the Warborn," Webb continued. "And where we come from, that means something. Because it means we do not give up just because the odds are bad. And we do not surrender just because victory seems impossible." "What do you do?" Dexiola asked. "We find a way to win anyway, or we die trying. But either way, we make the enemy pay for every inch of ground they take from us." The human's words echoed through the silent bridge. And Exala felt something she had not felt since the battle began. She felt hope. "Colonel Webb," she said, "you have permission to proceed, and may whatever gods your people believe in watch over you." "Thank you, General. But we do not need gods watching over us, because we have something better." "What is that?" "Each other, and that has always been enough." The channel went silent, and Exala stood very still as she processed what had just happened. 2,000 humans against the entire Victory Occupation Force. It was madness. It was suicide. But somewhere deep in her ancient predator brain, a voice whispered that maybe this was exactly what they needed. Colonel Marcus Webb stood in the ruins of what had once been Firebase Omega and watched his soldiers move through the smoke and shadows like ghosts. 2,000 had landed on Sentinel Ridge. When the battle began, 1,912 remained. That number should have been 0 when the Worldbreaker fired and the coalition fleet burned. Webb's forces had been stationed in the southern continent, a quiet zone far from the main fighting where nothing important was supposed to happen. They had watched the sky turn to fire, and they had lost contact with command, and they had seen the evacuation transports explode one by one as the Vexery closed there. Trap standard military doctrine said they should dig in, and wait for rescue or death, the Morvani would have done that. The Silithians would have sought an honorable last stand. The other species would have made peace with their gods and prepared for the end. The humans did something else. They attacked. Webb had gathered his officers in the basement of a destroyed building while the world burned around them, and he had asked them a simple question: how do we win? Lieutenant Chen had been the first to answer, pulling up a stolen Vexery data crystal on her portable display. Sir, the interdiction fields keeping everyone trapped are powered by 3 ground generators, and if we can take them out, then the coalition ships can escape. Where are they? Spread across the northern continent, each one guarded by at least 10,000 Vexery soldiers. Major Rodriguez had shaken his head at that number. Colonel, we have less than 2,000 people, and most of us are running low on ammunition after the last few days of fighting. I know, the math does not work. It never does, Webb had replied. But we are going to do it anyway, because that is what we do. Nobody had argued with him. Nobody had asked why they were Warborn, and they understood the name had started as a joke, something the first human soldiers had called themselves when they deployed to alien worlds and found that other species thought war was something you did carefully and politely. Other species fought for territory or resources or ideology, and they fought with rules and limits and always with an eye toward the eventual peace. Humans fought because fighting was written into their blood and bones and souls, passed down through 10,000 years of history, where the only way to survive was to be stronger and faster and more brutal than whatever was trying to kill you. Warborn did not fight for victory. They fought because not fighting was simply not something they knew how to do. Now that instinct had a purpose. Webb divided his forces into 3 teams, each one assigned to a different generator team. Alpha would hit the eastern target under Captain Morrison. Team Beta would take the western target under Lieutenant Chen. Team Gamma, the smallest group, would assault the central generator. The most heavily defended of the 3, Webb, would lead Team Gamma himself. Sir, Sergeant Major Okonkwo said as they prepared to move out, the central target has 30,000 Vexery around it, and you are taking only 600 soldiers. I am aware of the numbers, Sergeant Major. Then you know this is a suicide mission. Webb looked at the old soldier, the man who had served with him for 15 years across a dozen worlds, and he saw no fear in those weathered eyes, just acceptance. It is not suicide, Webb said. Suicide is dying for nothing, and we are going to die for something. And what is that? Time, Sergeant Major. We are going to buy enough time for the coalition to escape, and that is worth more than our lives. Okonkwo nodded slowly and checked his weapon one more time. Then we had better make it count. The Warborn moved across 300 kilometers of enemy-held territory in less than 2 days. They traveled at night, using the darkness as a weapon, and they avoided combat when they could. When they could not avoid it, they struck fast and hard and disappeared before the Vexery knew what had hit them. Webb had trained his people for this kind of warfare, the kind where you were always outnumbered and always outgunned, and your only advantages were speed and surprise, and the willingness to do things the enemy never expected. The first generator fell 41 hours after they set out. Captain Morrison and Team Alpha hit the eastern target at dawn, using stolen Vexery vehicles to get inside the perimeter before anyone realized they were not supposed to be there. The fighting lasted 3 hours, and when it was over, the generator was a smoking ruin, and Team Alpha had lost 200 soldiers, but they had won. The second generator fell 19 hours. Later, Lieutenant Chen led Team Beta through the Vexery defensive lines by crawling through drainage tunnels that the enemy had never thought to guard, emerging inside the facility itself and planting charges before the defenders could respond. The explosion killed another 150 humans, but the generator was destroyed now. Only the central target remained. Webb stood on a hill overlooking the Vexery fortress and counted the enemy soldiers spread out below him, 30,000 maybe. More, he had 600 people left after the march. 600 tired and wounded soldiers who had not slept in days and who knew exactly what was waiting for them. "Colonel," Lieutenant Park said quietly, "the math still does not work. I know. We cannot break through their lines." "We do not need to break through," Webb replied. "We just need to get inside and disable the generator long enough for the coalition to escape." "How long is that?" 18 minutes. Park was silent for a moment as he processed that number. 80 minutes, he repeated. "You want us to hold a position inside that fortress against 30,000 enemies for 80 minutes. That is correct. And then what?" Webb turned to look at his officer, and there was no hiding what both of them knew. "There is no and then, Lieutenant. There is only the mission." Park nodded and did not ask any more questions. He was Warborn understood as darkness fell over the fortress. Webb gathered his soldiers for the last time. They stood in small groups among the trees, checking their weapons and saying goodbye to friends they would never see again. Nobody cried, nobody begged to be left behind. They had all volunteered for this. "Listen up," Webb said, his voice carrying through the quiet night. "In a few hours we are going to attack that fortress, and most of us are not going to walk away from it." He paused and looked at the faces around him, young and old, men and women, all of them watching him with eyes that held no fear. "But I want you to know something, because it matters, and because someone should say it before we go." He took a breath and felt the weight of command settle onto him one last time. "What we do tonight will save lives. Thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands. And those people will go home to their families, and they will live because we gave them the chance." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "That is what being Warborn means. It means we fight when others cannot, we sacrifice when others will not. And we never ever give up just because winning seems impossible." He raised his weapon into the air. "Tonight we show the galaxy what humanity is made of. And win or lose, live or die, they will remember us forever." The soldiers around him raised their own weapons in response, and a sound rose up from the darkness, a sound that the Vexery had never heard before. It was the sound of humans preparing for war, and it was the most terrifying sound in the universe. The attack began at midnight when the moons of Sentinel Ridge were hidden behind clouds and the darkness was so thick you could almost touch it. 600 humans ran toward 30,000 Vexery soldiers, and the night exploded into chaos. Colonel Webb led the charge himself, his weapon firing in short, controlled bursts as he sprinted across the open ground between the tree line and the fortress walls. Around him, his soldiers fell, one after another, cut down by enemy fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But for every human that dropped, 3 more kept running. The Vexery had never seen anything like it. Their commanders had expected the humans to use tactics, to probe for weaknesses, to try and find a clever way through the defenses. Instead, the Warborn simply attacked, throwing themselves at the walls like a wave crashing against rocks, dying by the dozens, but never stopping, never slowing, never giving the defenders a moment to breathe. "They are insane," one Vexery officer transmitted to his superiors. "They do not fight like soldiers. They fight like animals." He was wrong. Animals fought to survive. The Warborn fought to win. Webb reached the outer wall with 200 soldiers still on their feet. The rest lay in the field behind him, their bodies marking the path of the assault like stones, dropped to show the way home. There would be no way home for any of them. Webb knew that. He had known it from the moment he gave the order to attack, but the mission was all that mattered now. And the mission required them to reach the generator. "Reaching charges," he shouted over the noise of battle. "Below the wall now." Sergeant Major Okonkwo, pressed the detonator, and a section of the fortress wall disappeared in a flash of light and thunder. The Warborn poured through the gap before the dust had settled, their weapons blazing, their voices raised in battle cries that echoed off the stone walls. The Vexery tried to stop them. They formed defensive lines and brought up heavy weapons and called for reinforcements from every part of the fortress. It did not matter. The humans carved through them like a knife through flesh, trading casualties at a rate that should have broken any fighting force, but only seemed to make the Warborn fight harder. Every time one of them fell, the soldiers around them picked up their weapons and kept going. Every time a Vexery thought the attack was finally stopping, another wave of humans appeared from somewhere unexpected. It was not fighting, it was fury given human form. General Dexala watched the assault from orbit, her eyes fixed on the sensor display that showed the battle unfolding in real time. They are actually doing it. Commander Yevshar breathed beside her. They are actually breaking through. At what cost? Dexala asked. Though she could see the answer on her screen, the human life signs were disappearing faster than she could count them, blinking out of existence one after another like stars dying in fast forward. But the survivors kept pushing forward, kept gaining ground, kept moving toward the generator at the heart of the fortress. All vessels, Dexala ordered, prepare for emergency departure, because we are going to have a window soon, and I want everyone ready to move. What about the humans? An officer asked. Dexala did not answer. There was nothing to say. Webb fought his way into the central building with less than 100 soldiers still standing. His combat armor was breached in 3 places, and blood was running down his left arm where a Vexery blade had found a gap in his defenses. He ignored the pain, because pain was just a signal, and signals could be turned off when there was work to do. Colonel, Lieutenant Park gasped over the radio. We have reached the generator room, but the detonator took damage during the assault. How bad? Bad enough that someone will have to trigger the charges manually. Webb understood what that meant. Manual detonation meant being in the room when the charges went off. It meant dying. I am on my way, he said. Sir, we need you to coordinate. There is no one left to coordinate, Lieutenant. Just get your people to the extraction point and get out of here. Silence on the channel for a moment, and then Park's voice came back, quieter than before. It has been an honor serving with you, Colonel. Likewise. Now move. Webb cut the connection and started running. The corridors of the Vexery fortress were filled with bodies. Human and alien mixed together in death. Webb stepped over them without looking down, because he could not afford to see the faces of his soldiers, could not afford to think about their families, waiting back on Earth for people who would never come home. He had 14 minutes left, 14 minutes until the coalition transports needed to launch, 14 minutes until all of this death meant something. A Vexery soldier appeared around the corner, and Webb killed him without breaking stride, his weapon finding its target before his mind even registered the threat. 2 more came after that, and he killed them too. His ammunition ran out halfway to the generator room, and he switched to his combat knife, using it with the cold efficiency of a man who had been trained to fight since childhood. The knife broke on a Vexery helmet, and Webb used his fists. His hands broke on Vexery armor, and Webb used his elbows, his knees, his forehead. Nothing was going to stop him. Nothing could stop him. It was Warborn, and he had a job to finish. The generator room was enormous, filled with alien machinery that hummed with barely contained power. Webb stumbled through the door with 8 minutes left on his internal clock, his body screaming in pain and his vision blurring at the edges. The charges were already planted. Neat packages of explosives attached to the critical systems that Lieutenant Park's team had identified before they withdrew the detonator lay on the ground nearby. Its casing cracked and its circuits exposed. Webb picked it up and turned it over in his bloody hands. Park had been right. The wireless trigger was destroyed, but The manual backup still worked. A simple button that would send a signal directly to the charges when pressed. All he had to do was press it and hold it for 3 seconds. 3 seconds and the generator would die. 3 seconds and the interdiction field would fall. 3 seconds and 60,000 Coalition soldiers would have a chance to escape. Webb looked at the button and thought about his daughter Sarah, who was probably watching this battle from somewhere far away. Wondering if her father was still alive, he thought about his wife who had died 5 years ago in a training accident, leaving him to raise Sarah alone. He thought about all the things he had wanted to do with his life, all the places he had wanted to see, all the quiet moments he would never have. Then he stopped thinking and started doing. He pressed the button. The explosion was visible from orbit. A flash of light that turned the Veggery fortress into a crater of molten stone and twisted metal. General Dex Allah watched it happen and felt something crack inside her chest. The generator is down, her sensor officer reported. The interdiction field is collapsing. How long do we have? At least 20 minutes before they can restore it. 20 minutes, more than enough time. All vessels, begin emergency evacuation now and tell the ground forces to move immediately. The coalition fleet surged into motion. Damaged ships and troop transports and everything that could still fly racing toward the gap in the Vexery defenses. Behind them, on the surface of Sentinel Ridge, 62,000 soldiers who had been waiting to die suddenly found themselves with a chance to live. They ran for the transports with everything they had, not looking back at the smoking crater, where 600 humans had given their lives. 417 ships made it through the gap before the Vexery could react. 60,000 soldiers escaped. 9,000 civilians. 12 species saved from slavery or death. And when the last transport cleared the interdiction zone and jumped to safety, Dexala finally allowed herself to breathe. The battle was lost, but the war was not over, because somewhere in the wreckage of that fortress, 17 humans were still alive, captured by the Vexery, who wanted to understand what kind of creatures could do what the Warborn had done. Those 17 humans sat in their cells and smiled at their captors and said the same thing over and over again. We are human, and you will meet more of us soon. The Vexery did not understand what that meant. They would learn. The Coalition Assembly Hall had never been so quiet. Representatives from 12 species sat in their designated sections, their eyes fixed on General Dexala as she stood at the central podium and delivered her report on the Battle of Sentinel Ridge. She told them about the fall of the fleet and the death of Admiral Kethvaranshi. Told them about the Vexery interdiction fields and the trap that should have killed everyone on the planet. And then she told them about the humans. 2,000 soldiers, she said, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. That was all they had. A token force sent to show solidarity with our alliance. And nobody expected them to make a difference. She paused and looked at the faces around her, seeing shock and confusion and something else that she could not quite name. But those 2,000 soldiers saw our people trapped and dying, and instead of accepting defeat, they chose to fight back. She activated the holographic display behind her, showing the tactical data from the assault. They crossed 300 kilometers of enemy territory in less than 2 days. They destroyed 2 heavily defended generator facilities with fewer than 2,000 troops. And then 600 of them attacked a fortress held by 30,000 Vexery soldiers. The numbers hung in the air like an accusation. 600 against 30,000. Dexala repeated. And they won, or rather they achieved their objective, which was to disable the final generator long enough for our forces to escape. Supreme Arbiter Volgan leaned forward in his crystal throne, his form flickering with troubled light. What was their casualty rate, General? 99%, Arbiter. Of the 1,900 humans who participated in the operation, only 17 survived. And those 17 are now prisoners of the Vexery Dominion. Murmurs swept through the chamber as representatives processed that information. They sacrificed themselves. Volden said slowly. They knew they would die and they did it anyway. Yes, why? Vexala had been thinking about that question since she escaped Sentinel Ridge, turning it over in her mind during the long journey back to Coalition space, because they could not accept defeat. She finally said, because something in their nature refuses to surrender even when surrender is the logical choice. She stepped away from the podium and walked closer to the assembled representatives. The humans have a concept they call never again, a promise they made to themselves after the worst atrocities in their history. A vow that they would never stand by while innocents suffered, if there was anything they could do to prevent it. A noble sentiment, Volden replied. But sentiment does not win wars. No, it does not, Vexala agreed. What wins wars is the willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve victory. And the humans have that willingness in ways that none of us have ever seen. She turned back to the display and brought up a new image. This one showing the human fleet that had been gathering at the edge of Coalition space. 100 warships, she said. 2 million soldiers. And a message that they transmitted to the Vexery Dominion 3 days ago. She played the recording. A human voice filled the chamber. Cold and hard and utterly without fear. This message is for High Executor Jaltath of the Vexery Dominion. You have 17 of our people in your custody, and we want them back. The voice paused for a moment before continuing. You have 1 standard week to release them unharmed. And if you fail to do this, we will come and take them ourselves. And we will burn everything in our path until we find them. This is not a threat. This is not a negotiation. This is simply a statement of what is going to happen. Release our people or face the consequences. You have been warned. The recording ended and the chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives shouted over each other, some demanding to know if the humans had lost their minds, others asking if this was some kind of trick. Still others simply staring at the display in stunned silence. Volden raised his hand and the noise slowly died down. General Vexala, he said carefully. Are you suggesting that the humans intend to invade Vexery space over 17 prisoners? I am not suggesting it, Arbiter. I am telling you that it is going to happen unless the Vexery comply with their demands. That is madness. No, Vexala replied. It is humanity, across the galaxy, in the capital of the Vexery Dominion. High Executor Jaltath was having a very similar conversation with his own advisors. Explain to me, he said, his voice dangerously calm, how a species that has only been in space for 2 centuries believes it can threaten the Dominion. His intelligence chief shifted uncomfortably before responding, High Executor. The humans appear to be operating on emotional rather than logical principles. And they seem to believe that the rescue of their captured soldiers is worth any cost. Any cost including the destruction of their entire species? That does appear to be their position, yes. Jaltath rose from his throne and walked to the window that overlooked his capital city. For 30 cycles the Dominion had conquered world after world, crushing any resistance with overwhelming force and advanced technology. 47 species had fallen before them. None had ever shown the kind of reckless aggression that the humans were displaying. What do we know about their military capabilities? He asked. Their fleet is smaller than ours by a factor of 10, the intelligence chief replied. Their weapons are less advanced, their ships are slower, and their strategic resources are limited. Then they cannot win. No. High Executor, mathematically speaking, they cannot. Jaltath turned to face his advisor, his eyes narrowing. Then why do you seem so worried? The intelligence chief hesitated before pulling up a holographic display showing footage from Sentinel Ridge. because we said the same thing about the 600 humans who attacked our fortress. And they achieved their objective anyway. The footage played, showing the Warborn charging across the open ground, dying by the dozens, but never stopping, never retreating, fighting with a ferocity that the Vexery had never encountered. They do not fight like other species, the chief continued. They fight like they have nothing to lose, and that makes them unpredictable. Unpredictable is not the same as dangerous, with respect. Executor, I believe in this case it might be. Jalteth watched the footage in silence, his mind working through the implications. The humans were weak. The humans were outnumbered. The humans should be no threat at all. And yet something about them made him uneasy. A feeling he had not experienced since the early days of his rise to power, when every victory had been uncertain. What did the prisoners say? He finally asked. They refused to speak, High Executor. Even under enhanced interrogation, they say nothing except that more humans are coming. And they smile when they say it. The intelligence chief nodded grimly. Yes, High Executor. They smile like they know something we do not. Jalteth stood very still for a long moment. Weighing his options, he could release the prisoners and appear weak in front of his own people. He could keep them and wait to see if the human threat was real, or he could strike first and destroy the human fleet before it ever reached Vexery space. The decision should have been simple, but something in the back of his mind whispered that nothing about the humans was ever going to be simple. Double the defenses around our core worlds, he ordered, and send our fastest ships to gather intelligence on the human fleet. And the prisoners? Jalteth smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Keep them alive for now, because they might be useful as bargaining chips. And if the humans attack, then we will teach them what happens to species that challenge the Dominion. He turned back to the window and looked out at his empire. Somewhere out there, 100 human ships were preparing for war, and for the first time in 30 cycles. High Executor Jalteth of the Vexari Dominion was not entirely certain of victory. Admiral Sarah Webb stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship Defiance and looked at the stars that would soon become a battlefield. She was 34 years old, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn streak. And right now, both of those things were focused on one goal: finding the 17 soldiers who had survived Sentinel Ridge and bringing them home. Her father was not among them. Colonel Marcus Webb had died pressing the detonator that destroyed the Vexery generator. His body vaporized in the explosion that saved 60,000 lives. Sarah had watched the battle from across the stars, had seen the flash that marked her father's death, had felt something inside her break and then reform into something harder and sharper than before. She had mourned for exactly 1 hour, then she had requested a combat command and begun planning the largest military operation in human history. Admiral, her tactical officer, reported, "We are approaching the Vexery border, and long-range sensors show a defensive fleet of approximately 300 enemy vessels. 3-to-1 odds," Sarah murmured. "My father had worse at Sentinel Ridge." "Yes, ma'am." She turned to face her bridge crew, seeing the determination in their eyes. They were all volunteers. Every single person in the fleet had asked to be here, knowing the risks, knowing the odds, knowing that many of them would not return, because that was what it meant to be human. "Open a channel to all ships," Sarah ordered. The communications officer nodded, and a moment later, Sarah's voice was being broadcast to every vessel in the fleet. "This is Admiral Webb to all Terran forces. We are about to enter Vexery space on a mission that most of the galaxy thinks is impossible." She paused and looked at the tactical display showing the enemy fleet ahead. The Vexery believe they understand war. And they believe that war is about numbers and technology and strategic advantages. But they are wrong. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. War is about will. It is about sacrifice. It is about the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seems certain. My father understood that. And so did every soldier who died at Sentinel Ridge. And today we honor their memory by showing the Vexery what humanity is truly capable of. She raised her chin and spoke the words that would echo through history. We are the Warborn. We do not surrender, we do not retreat, and we do not leave our people behind. Ever. All ships engage at will. The Battle of Vexer. Prime began with the Terran fleet charging directly into the heart of the Vexery formation. It was a suicidal tactic by any standard measure, throwing smaller ships against a larger force with no attempt at strategy or maneuver. But that was exactly what Sarah wanted the enemy to think, as the Vexery fleet moved to intercept. 36 Terran destroyers broke away from the main formation and activated their emergency drives, burning toward the flanks of the enemy position at speeds that should have torn their hulls apart. The Vexery commanders saw the maneuver too late by the time they realized what was happening. The destroyers were already among their support ships, weapons blazing. Crews prepared to die as long as they took the enemy with them. They are targeting our supply vessels. A Vexery officer screamed into his communicator. They are destroying our ammunition transports. How is that possible? High Executor Jalteth demanded from his command ship. Those destroyers should have been intercepted before they reached our lines. They were intercepted, High Executor, but they did not stop. Even when their shields failed, they kept coming. Jalteth stared at the tactical display in disbelief. The human destroyers were dying. One after another, their hulls ripped apart by Vexery weapons. Their crews burning in the void of space, but for every destroyer that fell, 2 or 3 Vexery support ships went with it, and without ammunition and supplies. Even the mightiest warship was just a floating target. The battle raged for 6 hours. And with every passing minute, the Vexery advantage grew smaller. Sarah Webb commanded from the front, leading her flagship into engagements that any sane officer would have avoided, trusting her crew to follow her into situations that seemed hopeless, and they did. Every single time when the Vexery brought their Worldbreaker into firing position, Sarah ordered a squadron of fighters to attack its power core while she personally led a boarding party against its command deck. She killed 11 Vexery soldiers with her own hands before reaching the bridge and planting the charges that would disable the weapon when the Worldbreaker's primary cannon exploded from the inside. The shockwave destroyed 4 Terran ships, but the weapon that had conquered 47 worlds was gone forever. High Executor, the Vexery intelligence chief said urgently, our fleet has lost 40% of its combat capacity and the humans show no sign of retreating. Jalteth could not believe what he was hearing. The humans had lost more ships than the Vexery. They had lost more soldiers by every measure. They were losing the battle and yet they kept fighting. Why will they not stop? He whispered, because stopping is not in their nature. The intelligence chief replied, I have studied their history, and they have fought wars like this before. Wars where they were outnumbered and outgunned. Wars that they should have lost. And did they lose? Sometimes, but even when they lost the battle, they often won the war, because their enemies grew tired of the cost while the humans never did. Jalteth looked at the tactical display and saw the truth in those words. His fleet was bleeding. His soldiers were dying and the humans just kept coming. Wave after wave, ship after ship. An endless tide of fury that seemed to grow stronger with every loss. For the first time in his life, High Executor Jalteth understood what it meant to fight an enemy that would not stop. He understood what it meant to be afraid. The battle ended not with a decisive victory, but with a Vexery retreats. Half ordered his surviving ships to fall back to defensive positions around the homeworld, abandoning the outer territories that had taken decades to conquer. The Humans followed them all the way to the gates of the capital, and there, with the Vexery fleet in ruins and the Dominion's power shattered beyond repair, Sarah Webb transmitted one final message. High Executor Jolteth, you have 1 hour to release our prisoners, or we will continue this war until there is nothing left of your empire but ashes and memories. The choice is yours. 43 minutes later, 17 human soldiers walked out of a Vexery prison ship and into the arms of their rescuers. They were thin and scarred, and they had suffered things that no one should ever have to suffer, but they were alive and they were going home. The war continued for another 4 years, and it was long and bloody and costly for everyone involved, but the outcome was never really in doubt after Vexer primed the Vexery. Dominion that had terrorized the galaxy for 30 cycles was broken. Its fleet scattered, its conquests liberated, its power reduced to a shadow of what it had once been on the day the Vexery formally surrendered. Admiral Sarah Webb stood before the Coalition Assembly and accepted the gratitude of 12 species. You saved us. Supreme Arbiter Volden said, when we had given up hope, you gave us a reason to believe that victory was possible. Sarah shook her head. We did not save you, Arbiter. We simply showed you what we were willing to do for those we care about. She looked at the representatives from a dozen worlds, species that had once dismissed humanity as a curiosity, a footnote in galactic history. We are the Warborn, she said. And that means we fight for what matters. We sacrifice for what we love. And we never leave anyone behind. You have us now, and we will never let you fall. Years later, on a memorial world built from the wreckage of Sentinel Ridge, the Coalition erected a monument to those who had given their lives in the battle that changed everything. At its center stood a statue of Colonel Marcus Webb and his Warborn, frozen in bronze at the moment of their final charge, their faces grim, their weapons raised, their eyes fixed on an enemy they could not defeat. And at the base of the statue, carved in letters that would last for 1,000 years, were the words that Sarah Webb had chosen herself. They were asked how many Warborn it took to conquer the impossible. The answer was all of them, and it was enough. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, humans and aliens alike gathered at that monument to remember what had happened and what it had cost. They remembered the soldiers who had died so that others could live. They remembered the sacrifice that had turned defeat into victory, and they remembered the lesson that the Warborn had taught the galaxy, that sometimes the only thing standing between darkness and light is a handful of people who refuse to give up, and that handful is always enough.